And welcome to the CCPC May membership meeting, which is an update on more issues. There seems to be no shortage of issues in the progressive activist community. My name is Steve Haleko. I'm the political director of the Cuyahoga County Progressive Caucus. And before we get to our very exciting speakers tonight, want to go over a few things. And the first thing is, we don't put a lot of links in the chat because people then tend to be going back and forth to the chat and watching what's going on. But instead, what we're going to do is send you an email tomorrow that will have like a comprehensive listing of links that are applicable not only to this meeting, but to upcoming CCPC events. That email will also have a link to join the Cuyahoga County Progressive Caucus. We sometimes get folks who come to our meetings, they see the topic, but they're not actually members. If you're not actually a member, membership in our organization is free. And chances are, if you saw the topics in this meeting and you came to it because of that, you will like what CCPC does in general, outside of what we're talking about in this meeting tonight. The email will also have a donate link. We are all volunteer funded, all volunteer staff. And if you can make a small contribution, that is always greatly appreciated. The email will also have a link to the recording of this event. We record all of our meetings on our YouTube channel, because what happens is a lot of times folks register for the event and then they can't make it, so they want to go back and look at the video. What we found with our Zoom meetings is we actually get a far greater number of people who look at the recording than who actually come to the meeting. So you'll get that as well, and please feel free to share it. The other thing the email will have is, and I got to turn my camera a little bit here so you can see this. We have very cool looking new CCPC t-shirts. So in the email tomorrow, you will get a nice color picture of the very cool looking CCPC t-shirt. And then there's a link you can click to order one. We are doing like a mail order sales of these t-shirts. So you don't have to go nowhere, just click the link and order a t-shirt. And finally, in the email tomorrow, we just got this set. Our meeting next month is going to be an outdoor in-person event, and it's on June 21st. So we decided to call the event CCPC Summer Solstice Outdoor Celebration. And if you remember last summer, we were on the west side for our summer picnic. This time we're going to be on the east side at Cumberland Park Pavilion in Cleveland Heights on Wednesday, June 21st from 6 to 8 p.m. And we'll send you the details of that, so that there's no need to try to write this down real quick right now. So let's get to our speakers. And our first speaker has some very sad news about what happened in Columbus today that you have probably heard, and what it applies to what I think practically all of you are doing, and that is gathering signatures for the abortion access constitutional amendment. So what I'd like to do is introduce Protect Choice Ohio's Cuyahoga County campaign manager, Troy Greenfield.
Hi, Steve and everyone. Thank you so much for having me tonight. Yes, we did get some, and I am Troy Greenfield, the field organizer for Cuyahoga County for Protect Choice Ohio. And we did get some bad news today. So the House has voted to approve SJR2, and it was 62 to 33. So pretty much right down party lines. And then it goes to the Senate tomorrow, and we expect that the Senate will pass in the Senate tomorrow. We expect it to pass. So we are further challenged with making sure we get voters to the polls in August, on August 8th, a Tuesday, to vote no to increase the requirement for a citizen-led constitutional amendment from 50% plus one to 60%. So we want to make sure that we get the word out. Everyone needs to get out and vote on August 8th to vote no to increase the requirement for citizen-led constitutional amendment from 50% plus one to 60%. I want to applaud and thank all of you who are on this call who have helped and continue to help and will help in the effort to get this constitutional amendment on the ballot in November so that the citizens of the state of Ohio can vote on having access to reproductive care through the private conversations with their doctors and their families, and not having state legislatures in their doctor's office with them. Women and families will be able to make those decisions, and it'll be private between their doctors and their families. So with that being said, there is a key element that is at play here in the state of Ohio, and that is the pro-life groups. So your pro-life groups are advocating for this increase from 50% plus one to 60% plus one. And they have convinced the Republican Party that if they are going to be part of the Republican Party, they have to be pro-life. If you are going to declare that you are a Republican candidate, the pro-life constituency and the money behind pro-life has stated that all Republicans must be pro-life. The Central Committee of the Republican Party voted on this, and the majority of the Central Committee for the Republican Party has deemed that all Republicans who run on a Republican ticket must be pro-life. And their reach is far in the Republican Party as it relates to pro-life and pro-life supporters and pro-life dollars. But we all know that the majority of people, over 60%, believe that reproductive decisions and decisions about your body and your health care should be between you and your doctor. So that is what we are fighting for. That is why we want to change the constitutional amendment to protect all Ohioans' rights to privacy when it comes to making decisions about their reproductive health care. And it's a private decision between them and their doctors, not them, the state and the state legislatures. Protect Choice Ohio wants to confidently say, because more than 60% of people support us making decisions about our own bodies and making those decisions between us and our doctors, that we will be successful turning out at the polls on April 8th and voting down this increase in the requirement from 50 plus 1 to 60%. We will be successful in that effort. We will stand with more than 240 organizations, former governors, attorney generals, concerned citizens, Ohioans all across the state, And we will defeat this attempt to end the majority rule when it comes to putting forth a citizen-led ballot initiative to change the Constitution in the state of Ohio. Pro-choice, Protect Choice Ohio is confident Ohioans will defeat this effort from the Republican Party to increase this percentage, and they believe it to be anti-democratic. And August, we will prevail, and we will get our reproductive ballot initiative on the ballot in November. So with that being said, I want to be encouraging. I want to applaud you for all of your efforts and your continued efforts moving forward. This is not over. We will be successful. We will vote down the increase in the percentage for a citizen-led initiative, and we will win when this ballot initiative is placed on the ballot in November of 2023. So keep fighting, keep your energy up, keep your positivity up. The numbers are behind us. We have the support of over 60% of Ohioans, from governors to legislators to your family and friends and coworkers, that this is a private decision. This is a healthcare decision that is private between you and your doctors, and our state legislatures are overreaching with this demand to be involved in those personal, private decisions that you're making with your doctors. I want to say, if you have any questions, I am now open to questions related to this issue, and also signature collections, or anything that Protect Choice Ohio is working towards with this effort.
So I'm just going to step in here. If you have a question, please raise your hand, go down to your actions button and actually do the raise hand, or you can put it in the chat and I'll watch the chat for you. Troy.
So while Debbie is doing that, I want to also inform everyone that we are on target with our signature collections to meet our goal of 700,000 signatures by July 5th. So I know it's discouraging that there isn't a meter that we can all watch as every signature comes in to tell us exactly where we are. However, I want you to be confident, and I want you to stand tall and know that we are accomplishing our goal. We are progressing as needed to reach our goal of 700,000 signatures. One reason why they are not publishing it is because we don't want others on the other side to know, because they will ramp up their attacks on our efforts. We are already receiving disruptors coming to our events, trying to get people not to sign the petition. That's not working. And we're going to continue to collect signatures, and we will meet our goal. We will get 700,000 signatures, and this ballot, citizen-led ballot initiative, will be on the ballot in November. So Susie, what's your question?
Hi, Troy. Thank you for being here tonight and for your optimism. I apologize if you had already covered this. I had to step out for a minute. But part of the legislation that was passed today, I thought that it was an elimination of the curing period for signatures. Is that right, or am I thinking about something else?
So part of the legislation that they are voting on is not only to increase the percentage from 50% plus one to 60%. Another part of that legislation is to take away the curing time. And for everyone listening, the curing time is that time after we've turned in our ballots and they come back and say, you have 650 valid signatures, or we don't have, say we're only 500, we're 500 valid signatures short of the required number of signatures we need for this ballot initiative. That curing period would give us time to get those 500 signatures that we need so that it would be on the ballot in November. So that is the curing period they want to remove from this process.
Steve?
Troy, I know you guys have some very competent professionals that are managing the campaign, but what I was thinking is from this point on, I think it would be a really good idea if our petition circulators mentioned the August election and what's at stake to everybody who signs the petition. And if cost wasn't prohibitive, maybe have a handout to give to people who signed the petition explaining what's at stake on the August election, because they might be in a hurry, but if you have a handout, is that something that sounds like a good idea and might be doable?
Yes, Steve, that sounds like a great idea. And it is also something that Protect Choice is working on putting together. In lieu of this now potentially coming to fruition tomorrow, we will have materials that will talk about the upcoming election on August 8th to vote this down. And the reasons why we would be voting it down. To go back to Susie's question, it won't increase the requirement of signatures if it's increased to 60% and we lose that curating time. The number of signatures we need will not change. And the reason the number of signatures we need will not change because this bill does not include increasing the number of counties from 44 to a higher number. It will stay at 44 counties, requiring 5% of voters from the previous gubernatorial election to sign the petition. So that means our number of required signatures will not change. We are targeting 50 different counties to collect our required number of signatures. And I don't have a list of those 50 counties, but we're going above and beyond what's required and collecting 700,000 signatures. And we will have met the requirement of the 5% in 50 of those counties within that 700,000 number.
Troy, do you want me to do the chat message or questions, or do you have them?
Yes, you could do the chat. That would be helpful, Deb.
Okay, so we have, since the bill is anti-democracy, are there any efforts to get national attention on this initiative so it will reach more voters and mobilize them to vote against the amendment on August 8th? The 60% threshold would affect more than just abortion rights. Many citizens would be against this. So is there an effort to get national attention?
Yes, there will be an effort to get national attention, and also.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Yes, sir. Of course you did. And there will be the big part of this is now it's going to cost more money for us to do this because now we have to produce commercials. Now we have to produce more printed materials that talk about the November 8th election. So now we have to do more fundraising. More money is needed for this campaign effort to get this citizen-led initiative forward to the ballot by having to spend more money to promote this this August 8th election. So yes, they will put out literature and get national attention on this effort as much as they possibly can. with the funds and money that they have. But also remember, then this whole effort costs more money to accomplish our goal.
So another question is how much of the effort is being done by the grassroots volunteers versus paid circulators? And then just to go a little bit further with that question, at a certain point, it would be nice to know when my efforts are better used outside my county. Will you all let us know?
Yes, we will let you know when your efforts are needed in other counties. The paid circulators, I am not clear as to what percentage of signatures they have collected versus what our grassroots organizers have collected. My guess is that the grassroots organizers' signature collections are higher because we started before the paid signature collectors started. And then secondly, I would think the grassroots signature collection numbers are higher because we are individuals who are motivated by the passion of this issue. We are talking to our families and friends, and we are committed to making sure that every last signature that we collect is properly inputted on that signature page with a due diligence that isn't seen from a paid circulator.
And we have a question, do we have data on how the other counties' efforts are going? Are we on track, I guess?
So to answer your question, we are on track to meet our goal of 700,000 signatures within the counties needed for our ballot initiative. So as long as we keep pace with what we're doing and everyone stays engaged and comes out to volunteer and to donate and talking to their friends and family about signing the petition, we will meet our goal.
Any other questions?
Yes, agreed. Is that Aliza? The harder the first week of signatures was really easy, and the last week of signatures will be more challenging. You're right, because the first actors have pretty much signed the petitions. So now we have to put in that little extra bit of effort to get those last signatures that we need to make sure that we reach our goal. And in doing so, please speak to people about this being a healthcare issue. It's about your healthcare and the privacy of you making decisions with your doctor about your healthcare. That's inclusive of several elements related to reproductive healthcare.
So we do have another question. Who's coordinating the August 8th campaign?
Well, considering that this just came down today, and we still have yet for the Senate to vote on it, I don't have that information yet. But as soon as I get it, I can pass it along to Steve, and he will get it out to you.
Okay, Steve, that's it in the chat.
Going once, going twice on questions for Troy? Okay, our next guest is going to talk about something happening in schools that, for me, being a retired teacher, is very important. I'd like to introduce Cleveland State University law professor Matthew Ahn to talk about what critical race theory really is and how it might affect school board elections this fall.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everybody. My name is Matthew Ahn. I am a visiting professor at Cleveland State University's Law School. Just give me a moment while I try to share my screen and queue up the presentation that I have. While I'm doing that, just by show of hand raises, how many folks have heard somebody else talking about critical race theory? All right, decent number of folks. Now, by show of the same raised hands, how many folks think that they could confidently define what critical race theory is? A few folks, all right, but fewer folks. And I think that's right? Because oftentimes the discourse around critical race theory is such that the folks who are sort of talking about it in the loudest tones are not really interested in telling you what critical race theory even is. And so I have a presentation here in 3 parts. First, I'm going to give you the facts. I'm going to tell you what critical race theory actually is and is not. Then we're going to talk briefly about the noise, the actual sort of conversation that is happening about critical race theory and how that may or may not be aligned with what critical race theory actually is. And then the way forward. I'm going to talk about how you should be thinking about critical race theory and how you should be talking about critical race theory in some of these settings. All right. Is everybody able to see my screen? Yep,
Yes,
good.
good.
Okay, great. All right. So let's go ahead and dive into the facts. So critical race theory stems from an incident that happened about 45 years ago. So in the 1970s, Harvard Law School had exactly one Black professor, and his name was Derek Bell. Derek Bell was, over the course of the 1970s, developing a very popular course in law school on race, racism, and the law. It was one of the most popular classes at Harvard Law School. But at the same time, Derek Bell was trying to push the administration of the law school to hire a woman of color to their faculty. And the law school kept, giving excuses as to why they couldn't do this. Eventually, in 1980, Derek Bell became sort of fed up with Harvard's excuses, and he decided to leave Harvard Law School and go become the dean at the University of Oregon's law school. So students, upon hearing this news, asked Harvard Law School to hire a professor of color to replace Derek Bell and to teach his race, racism, and the law class. And Harvard's response to that was, well, wouldn't you rather have a qualified professor instead? And the students, of course, were not happy about this response. They were really angry. But what they realized is, hey, we don't really have the vocabulary to explain why we're angry and what we really want to see. And so they got together, they created this alternative race, racism, and the law course, rather than the one that was taught by the replacement professor who happened to be white. And they came up with a lot of these concepts that have turned into this discipline of critical race theory. Now, that doesn't really explain what the doctrine actually is. And I think at its simplest level, critical race theory, or CRT, is a series of related legal philosophies and legal philosophical approaches. And CRT sort of builds off of this idea of critical legal studies, which is a separate legal philosophical approach that focuses on the way that legal structures and institutions sort of grow and change, and how they sort of concentrate power, generally in a small group of people, especially in this country. And generally, these practitioners seek to understand how the development of the law influences and is influenced by the way that people like us or institutions think about race. All right. So there are a lot of different related concepts that you may have heard of that at least have some kind of relationship to CRT. Things like institutional bias, or affirmative action, or intersectionality. These are some terms that you may have heard, especially in the last few years, that folks have been using that do have some roots in critical race theory. But even the concepts as you may understand them are generally relatively simplified concepts, or they're not quite exactly what critical race theory practitioners mean when they use those terms. For example, this affirmative action we often think of either in terms of higher education admissions or in hiring. But the CRT version of affirmative action is much broader than that and refers to a much sort of more abstract concept than how we think about affirmative action. And there are plenty of other concepts in critical race theory that you likely haven't heard of. Things like hegemony and structural consent, the idea of formal race as compared to status race, interest convergence, reconstructive theology, and retrenchment. I'm actually going to take you through a very simplified example in a couple of slides of some of these concepts. But CRT ultimately is a legal philosophy course. And so a lot of these legal philosophical concepts are very sort of removed from our typical sort of everyday conversation. Just as a note, in order to take my critical race theory class at Cleveland State, you need to take property law, criminal law, administrative law, and at least one semester of constitutional law. Otherwise, you are not going to have the conceptual basis to understand some of the concepts that we discuss in the class, right? Given that we are often told that critical race theory is taught to 7-year-olds, we can sort of dispel with that fairly quickly. All right. So I just want to walk through a very quick and simplified example of how critical race theory can be applied to our system of laws. And maybe an easy example is the idea of jury selection. So prosecutors are not allowed to discriminate by race in the jury selection process. This was something that actually did not get enshrined in constitutional law until the mid-1980s. But this is ultimately unconstitutional. That being said, we have some enforcement mechanisms that a lot of commentators believe are not sufficient to actually ensure that we don't have racial discrimination in jury selection. I'm going to read you just 2 quick quotes from the same commentator 30 years apart. And I'd like you to think about, right, these particular sentiments, this idea that enforcement isn't strong enough, and ask yourself, and put in the chat, who do you think said these 2 things? The first comment is from 1989. The problem with detection of racial discrimination in the jury selection process extends beyond discovering overt racism. Examples of subtle stereotyping and racism point out the need for stronger enforcement, since arguably much racism and racial stereotyping is lodged in the subconscious and will stay there unless forced out into the open. I mean, those are pretty strong statements that we need to make sure that racial discrimination does not exist in the jury selection process. 30 years later, the same person said this quote, "In the real world of criminal trials against Black defendants, both history and math tell us that a system of race-based jury strikes does not treat Black defendants and Black prospective jurors equally with prosecutors and white prospective jurors." Again, I think something that we here in this space all agree with and would support in terms of increasing protections for jury selection. Who do you think said both of these things? And I guarantee it's a name that almost all, if not all of you have heard of. If you want to put it in the chat, I'd like to see who you might think said these 2 things. All right, I have somebody who says Michelle Alexander, the person who wrote the new Jim Crow. That is a great guess. It's not quite correct. All right, somebody said Justice Ginsburg. That's another very good guess. And indeed, this person is a judge, but it's not Justice Ginsburg. Any other thoughts? Any other ideas? Going once, going twice? So I can tell you, the person who said these 2 things is Brett Kavanaugh. Now, how do we think about this, right? Brett Kavanaugh, in his student note at Yale Law School, argued that the jury selection protections against racial discrimination were not strong enough. He wanted them to be stronger. And again, in 2019, this was in a Supreme Court opinion. He said, hey, we know how to deal with overt discrimination, but we need to deal with structural issues with how we think about discrimination in jury selection. So how do we think about this information? Right? Is Brett Kavanaugh actually a secret progressive? And CRT has some very complicated thoughts on this issue. The answer is no. But there are some insights that we can take from how Kavanaugh approaches this particular question. He's been consistent on it for 30 years, but it doesn't mean that he is one of us necessarily, right? Ultimately, what CRT would tell us is that Kavanaugh has an interest that converges with our interests. He wants strong jury selection protections for a different reason than we want those strong jury selection protections. We want them because we want to make the criminal legal system less punitive, less harsh, and more fair. But folks like Kavanaugh instead want to ensure that society sees the criminal legal system as legitimate. In other words, he wants to make sure that we as a society structurally consent to the criminal legal system and thus to some of the punishments that that system doles out. And indeed, for folks like Kavanaugh, discrimination in jury selection undermines the whole system, right? Not just the criminal legal system itself, but also certain institutions that he seeks to strengthen, such as jails and prisons, in addition to the court system. And so he sees this discrimination in the jury selection process as a defiance of his role as a judge and ultimately his philosophy, which is very pro-incarceration, as we can see from some of his other opinions. So in other words, what he's trying to do here is to defend the injustices of jails and prisons credibly, because he can say, hey, we've got these strong protections against discrimination in jury selection. The system is fair. What are you complaining about? There's no issue. And so his unexpected stance is actually still very consistent with the worldview that he has. This is the kind of insight that critical race theory is looking for within the legal system. Now, I threw a lot of concepts at you all at once. And so if this doesn't make perfect sense to you, that's fine. I spend an entire 3-hour class with my law students on this particular topic. And so I'm just giving you a very quick overview of it. I do want to note, though, there are a couple of things that CRT is not. Right? First off, critical race theory is not just teaching real American history or reframing American history. Indeed, we already have a term for that, and it's history. Ultimately, I think that what this claim does is give bad faith actors just enough of an opening to say, well, okay, if CRT is just teaching American history, then they really are teaching it to 7-year-olds. And so this argument, while I think it is generally well-meaning, and I've seen actual CRT practitioners make this argument, I think it's ultimately counterproductive. And indeed, on top of that, CRT is not every discussion of race, diversity, equity, inclusion, or discrimination. And we're going to get into this in a little bit, but I think that oftentimes the assumption that a lot of these folks are making, folks who are yelling about CRT in our schools, they want you to conflate every discussion of race with CRT. Ultimately, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which have become very popular in the last several years, they often do incorporate some simplified critical race theory concepts, but critical race theory as a legal philosophy is distinct from those initiatives. And oftentimes those initiatives, right, they are more or less effective. And some of the less effective ones are actually really fertile grounds for critical race theory to critique the efforts that some folks are making in service of diversity, equity, and inclusion if they are not done well. All right, so As I said, I've just thrown a ton of information at you. And so if you're still a little bit confused about what critical race theory is precisely, that's fine. Ultimately, this is part of the problem, is that it is not easy to explain in a nutshell. And I think that's part of what leads to all of this noise. So CRT is not a new thing in terms of right-wing interests trying to use it to politically damage Democrats and progressives. Ultimately, the first time that that critical race theory was sort of used as a political football was actually during the 2012 presidential election. It wasn't Romney's camp, but some folks, particularly housed at Breitbart and some other similar sort of commentary outlets, tried to tie Barack Obama to one of his professors, Derek Bell. It didn't work. It was not successful. Very few people remember that this even happened. But it was something that came up because Derek Bell actually did come back to Harvard and was a mentor to Barack Obama while Obama was at Harvard Law School. Interestingly enough, just as a footnote to what we were talking about earlier, Bell actually left Harvard a second time because in 1991, he was like, I've been yelling at you to hire a woman of color onto your faculty for 20 years now, and you haven't done it. Harvard wouldn't hire a woman of color to their law school faculty until 1998. All right. I think the biggest problem, though, in terms of why CRT has become this big political football is that it's difficult to define. I never really gave you a single definition of critical race theory. And that makes it a very easy political target, because generally in politics, if you're trying to explain, you've already lost. And so the simple, incorrect message is actually going to do better than the correct, nuanced message. Precise and accurate definitions of critical race theory, I mean, I've already used a lot of legal jargon, and that does not lend itself particularly well to the kinds of political sound bites that are actually successful. And part of this is that critical race theory, as a relatively new doctrine, it's only about 40 years old, the scope of it is still debated even among practitioners. As I've said, some of them have said this is just teaching real American history. Again, personally, I believe that that's counterproductive. And honestly, and I do think this matters, the term critical race theory itself just sounds a little scary. I have been telling folks for over a year, if it were just called biblical grace theory, we wouldn't be here. There wouldn't be any issue. The fact that it sounds like this sort of very scary thing, I think helps people project their own insecurities about race onto this term and this concept. All right. So who ultimately benefits from all of this, though? And the answer is the same as it's always been. This is just the latest in a long line of Republican attempts to capitalize on a politics of fear. And ultimately, I think the opportunity that conservative special interests see here is the opportunity to dismantle our system of public education. They are using CRT as this false wedge issue in school board elections and in other local elections in order to bring folks out to vote for their interests and for the dismantling of our public education system. Think about some of the things we've seen, not just in Ohio, but in other states that have been introduced recently. Things that directly attack teachers and the public school systems, right? Don't say gay bills. Bills that increase political control over universities and professors. House Bill 83 just got amended, I think, today. And other pushes, maybe not necessarily legislative, for things like vouchers or charter schools or homeschooling. Apparently, even if your homeschooling curriculum is openly Nazi, that's apparently fine in the state of Ohio. These are the kinds of things that the right-wing special interests are using CRT to normalize and to push through. And ultimately, what that does to our society is it makes it harder for us to organize. These kinds of policy discussions that we want to have with folks are only possible when you and the person you're talking to agree on the basic facts that exist in our society. And if our public education system is dismantled, then it's much less likely that you and that person are going to agree on the facts. And that makes the job of organizing and of building capacity and of building power that much harder, because you have to start 3 steps earlier than you would have had to start otherwise. And this is not just ultimately about the conservative special interests, but about the way that this has turned into a runaway phenomenon is not the right word, but a runaway issue. You have Republican true believers who are willing to repeat this misinformation regardless of whether or not it's true. And funny enough, critical race theory itself would conclude that many of these voters see direct value in using these flimsy pretexts, in trying to sort of advocate directly for continued racial, gender, and other inequality as a way to make Democrats and progressives mad. And that is ultimately the policy goal that I think has overtaken large segments of the Republican Party. Now, we can talk about sort of what Trump is relative to the Republican Party, but I do think one of the things he was able to normalize very quickly was the idea that goal number 1 is let's make Democrats mad. And a lot of folks, I think over the last 6 or 7 years, have taken that up as their primary goal, regardless of what the policy happens to be. Now, even well-meaning moderates will oftentimes see this as a one side of a debate, and they will repeat or acknowledge this misinformation and thus unintentionally reinforce it for folks who might otherwise be persuadable. Liberal and progressive Democrats often insist on responding to some of this bad faith trolling with good faith responses. And again, I think that further reinforces the misinformation. One quote I've heard a couple of times recently, and I think it really applies here: Democrats insist on painting a complete picture with background and context, while Republicans repeat the same message into the ground, regardless of its merit, and they win. So what do we do about this? How do we move forward? Right. And so ultimately, critical race theory, again, has a very complicated and detailed plan for how to explain CRT in political spaces. And the answer is, don't do it. No, I'm serious though. Like, don't actually get into the substance of critical race theory. Unless you are 100% certain that your audience really wants to get into the weeds, you should try to explain as little as possible about critical race theory when you discuss it. Indeed, how many folks here feel confident that they could give the sort of first half of this presentation without any further study of CRT? I threw a lot of concepts at you very quickly. You're going to get muddled very quickly, and you're going to get bogged down in a discussion that's not actually helpful to you. Indeed, you should seriously forget everything that I said in the first 5 slides of this presentation. What you want to do instead is to reject the framing of folks who are trying to make CRT this wedge issue. Instead, tie that misinformation to wealthy special interests who are attempting to dismantle public education. In other words, we want to treat this right-wing misinformation about critical race theory as so clearly wrong that it's not even worth critically engaging with. Now, there are a couple different settings where this might come up. You may be talking to somebody who has heard some of these untruths. They may be on the fence, or they may be leaning in that direction. How do you talk to them? And I think the first thing you want to try to do is to tie their concern to a broader shared goal, something underlying their concerns, right? You and I, you who has heard some of these things, right? I know that you're concerned that you want your children to have the tools to function well in the world that we have, a rapidly changing world, one that seems out of control at some times. That's what we both want to do. Let's try to talk about how best to do that. And that's a good opportunity to pivot to an explanation about the most important concepts that we want to make sure are taught in schools. Ideas like empathy, ideas like fairness and inclusion. I did see a video recently circulating where some of these anti-CRT folks were talking about some of the things that were in their children's lessons plans. And one of them was like, oh, well, they're trying to teach our kids empathy. And one of the other folks was like, oh, empathy, ew. And if you think about that, that's ridiculous. And I think if other folks see that that's sort of where they're willing to go in service of this misinformation, then I think that's a really compelling point in our favor. Like, this is what we want our values to be. These are the values we want to teach our children. And if somebody wants to stand against those values, let them do it. Because if they pivot to that, they're going to lose. And we can take a page out of the Republicans' playbook. Use the tactic of repetition to your advantage. If you're talking to somebody you see every so often, you want to keep repeating those talking points several times. There's good research out there that shows that people aren't even open to changing their mind until they've had 7 conversations about a topic. This is why repetition is so important. So you want to make sure that you're articulating your vision for our schools, the idea of empathy and fairness and inclusion, and that being what our schools focus on. And again, don't explain what CRT actually is, again, unless it is clear that this person is only going to be persuaded if they understand what CRT is. So now what do you do if you get one of these quote unquote true believers? There may still be room to talk with them, believe it or not. You can try to assess quickly whether there's any room to change their mind. And if you think there's common ground to be found, right, then you can try to find it. But you don't want to chase them in logical circles over and over. And an easy way to try to figure this out, ask questions. Right? This is sort of parallel to this concept of deep canvassing. Some of you may have heard of this before, right? We're trying to connect in depth with somebody's fundamental ideas of fairness, rather than about a specific issue where you're trying to throw a bunch of information at them all at once. Again, though, we want to be careful that your audience isn't trying to waste your time in turn. Because again, sometimes that's all they're trying to do. They want to make the liberals mad, and the way that they think might be best to do that is to simply waste your time. Again, try to ask questions, because if you ask questions about the assumptions they're making, either you're going to get to that shared common ground very quickly, or you're going to realize that all they're doing is repeating the talking points in response to whatever you're saying. And I see a comment in the chat that I think is really important here, right? We want to make sure that we're not condescending about this. And again, I think asking questions is really important for that, right? We want to know more about why you think the way you do. Let's make sure that I understand what you're saying before I try to draw conclusions from what you're saying. All right. And if you think there's no common ground to be found, it's not a loss to simply step away. Indeed, that's a win. That's maybe 10, 15 minutes that you are not spending on somebody who cannot be reached. It is fine to simply walk away. Ultimately, it may feel like you're writing off 50% of the population when you do this. But what polling has showed is that these folks who are yelling about critical race theory are not the majority of the Republican Party. They are a very small minority even within the Republican Party. And they just feel like 50% of the population because they're loud and they repeat their points over and over again. Our audience ultimately is the other 90% of the Republican Party, or right, the folks in the middle. There are so many other folks out there that can be reached. You do not need to spend your time talking to somebody who can't be reached. Now, sometimes these conversations or these interactions, let's say, with some of these true believers happen in a public space. Maybe a school board meeting, maybe a city council meeting, something along those lines. The first thing that you want to keep in mind, you do not want to give them the satisfaction Oftentimes they are there just to try to press your buttons. Don't let them have that satisfaction. Again, you want to reject the misinformation out of hand. These folks ultimately are an easy mark for the special interests that want to divide and distract us. Say that. You can say that. I think that's important to try to reframe the conversation around what's really happening here. It's another right-wing attack on our society and our democracy. And again, pivot back to the values that are important. We want to teach our children empathy, fairness, inclusion. We want to give them the tools to live in this world that feels very unsettled, very scary. Without these tools, these children are not going to function well when they grow up and become adults. And the most important part here is that your target audience is not that true believer that's on the other side of that public conversation. It's everybody else who's watching, right? Those are the folks who are ultimately more persuadable. Oftentimes, those folks will end up moving toward those right-wing talking points because nobody steps up to challenge them. And that's what we're trying to do. We want to show the other folks who are really on the fence, who haven't thought about these issues as much as you or I have. We want them to understand where we're coming from, right? Don't get frustrated, right? Again, oftentimes the other person is going to see you being frustrated and they will consider that a win. Don't give them that satisfaction. So these are sometimes maybe counterintuitive tactics to try to deal with folks who are spouting misinformation about CRT. But these reframings will help us be able to push back on some of these misinformation, these untruths, and so on and so forth. It takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of deliberate thinking about how to do this. But we can do this. We can beat the folks who are spouting this misinformation. We can win these school board elections. We can make sure that our schools are geared toward teaching our children empathy and fairness and inclusion. It will take all of us. And so I am happy to take questions at this time. I know there's a few in the chat already. I will go back through and work through the backlog and go forward from there. If otherwise, right, you have any other questions, I will make sure these slides are available. This is my personal email. Please feel free to email me at any time. So one of the questions in the chat, are we able to visit your teaching of this course while you're lecturing? So ultimately, one of the things that I do to make sure that the students are comfortable with talking about some of these sensitive issues is to sort of place an agreement of confidentiality over the class. So I don't allow visitors unless they have prior approval to sit in on the class, because I want to make sure that some of the students who may not have much of a grounding in some of the ideas we're covering, I want them to feel comfortable to talk through what they're thinking in class. But I am happy to sort of talk through some of these concepts in a different setting, and maybe in sort of a public meeting setting. That is something that I think I can absolutely do. All right.
Matthew,
Yes.
just 1 second. Can you, for some reason, it's not letting me stop the screen share. Could you do that, please?
I will do that. There we go.
Probably that updated wanted to do. Thank you.
Absolutely. Am I available for family Thanksgiving dinners? Only if there's vegetarian options, but yes, otherwise. Any other thoughts? Any other questions? Okay, comment. Simple explanation of CRT is thinking through a lens of race and institutions about the law. I think that's a very, I mean, the professor in me is like, there's a couple of quibbles I'd make to that, but I think that's a very good boiled down explanation of it. And yeah, I'd be happy to chat separately if you want to email me about that article. Yeah, I'd love to chat about it. So how's this presentation been received? When you've been giving it other places? Generally, I think folks are really interested in this issue. This is sort of the defining issue of a lot of these school board races that are happening across the county this year. And we've been hearing this misinformation about CRT now for 2-3 years at this point. And there's not really a good, I think, easy explanation of how to deal with that. That's what I'm trying to do here, and I hope it's been helpful.
We have a raised hand, Mike.
Hey everybody, hi, I'm Matthew. I did have a question at the beginning of your presentation or your lecture. You sort of, I sort of feel like you said the basis of CRT, or the main concept was the ability to, or the requirement not to discriminate on juries based on race. And I was thinking about that in a sense, if the vast majority of defendants in America, at least percentage wise, are disproportionately minority, and jury pools are probably the opposite. They're disproportionately most likely white. So what sort of, I guess at a larger scale would create equity in creating more balanced jury pools? I assume poverty, family responsibilities, and the ability to be a registered voter are some of the reasons why minorities may not be potential jurors in larger numbers. So that's a federal issue. So what can we do? What can we do about that?
Sure. It's so and what I'll do is actually define a term I hesitated to define earlier. In the critical race theory context, affirmative action means, hey, we've got to think about this problem not just with one solution, but we've got to try a bunch of different things, see what works, and adjust our strategy over time. That is the CRT concept of affirmative action. And I think it ultimately applies here, right? Because there are so many different barriers that you just mentioned right now, right? The idea that only registered voters are pulled for jury duty, for example. And so if somebody believes the system isn't working for them, as a lot of especially Black men today believe, then they're not even going to be eligible for these juries. And so there has to be a sort of multi-pronged approach, I think, for any individual issue. Right? There's always going to be an education component. There's always going to be a legislative component. There is oftentimes, but honestly, less often than you think, room for litigators and civil rights litigators in particular to help out. But again, because the court itself is an institution that is subject to these same biases, we cannot rely, by and large, on the courts to save us, despite that being how it may have felt, especially in the early 2010s. And I know that's not a particularly satisfying answer, but it really is, hey, let's zoom out and do all of these things as much as we can.
I don't see any hands. Deb, do we have anything else in the chat?
No, wait. Well, thank you. You're getting lots of thanks.
Oh, okay. That's good. That's great. So, and anything else before we sign off here tonight, folks? All right. If you missed the beginning, first of all, thank you to Matthew and to Troy for being here tonight. If you missed the beginning, next month, June, we are going to be live and in color on the East Side on June 21st. So we thought a nice title for the event would be CC Summer Solstice Outdoor Celebration, June 21st from 6 to 8 p.m. at Cumberland Park Pavilion in Cleveland Heights. And we will be getting you the details of that event very soon, like tomorrow. So thanks for coming this evening, folks. And let's give Matthew and Troy a round of applause for their great presentations.